Welcome everyone to our Majlis. Most of you probably know that Jonathan, who is our guest today, is a proper scholarly star. I respect him enormously for his will and ability to reach out and leave our academic ivory towers. But I didn't know anything about his achievements in depth when I invited him. Much to his credit, he is with us today just due to the value of his scholarship. I've never had the privilege to meet him in person yet. We met online for the first time when he attended one of our majlises. Today we meet for the second time, and it's a great joy to have him with us, and I'm most eager to listen to what he will say about himself, his journeys, and the intriguing topic he proposed. Jonathan, welcome to your Majlis.
Thanks very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here, especially seeing all the other people who've participated over the last couple of sessions. It's really an impressive group of people. And in case I don't get to talk a lot about the topic of the actual book, I kind of talked about it before in a talk I gave many years ago at SOAS, and so that's on YouTube, and I just put it in the chat. If anyone wants to, it feels that they didn't get kind of enough the discussion of the actual substance of the book, then you can probably listen to this talk as well. So I just put that in the link in case. So what happened, I want to talk about the book, but I also I thought it'd be useful to talk about for people who are younger or who have questions about how books get written, how actually the challenges of writing a book and or at least how I do it. Everybody, I'm sure, has different approaches. Okay, so the base of this book is kind of about two things. One, it's a history of what's called madhalim or mazalim courts in Islamic civilization, which are sometimes translated as tribunals for grievances or tribunals for addressing wrongs. Madhalim, short or plural of madlima in Arabic, is a grievance or a wrong done. And the book is really about the question of what you do when the law that is derived, God's law, the Sharia, when the details of the Sharia, when the rulings of the Sharia seem to be out of sync with or in discord with your expectations of justice. So that's really what the book is about. And of course, you can imagine, I mean, this is a problem which has been discussed going back to Aristotle's time, if not before, about sometimes you have legal rulings that seem unjust or results of cases that seem unjust. This doesn't necessarily have to present any kind of crisis or problem, but it does if you think that your law is derived from revelation and ultimately kind of reflects God's will, in which case, how do you explain how it's giving you an unjust ruling? One could take the crisis sort of to another level and say, how do you define justice, right? If justice is what God wants or what God orders, then how do you even explain why you feel that the ruling is unjust? Like, how do you explain that you have a sense of justice that is not actually totally matching with the result of the law? Like, where is that justice coming from? Is that actually a real feeling? Is that like a valid objection you have, a valid sense of injustice, or is that some kind of misfiring of your appetites or your desires or your biases? So these are the question that really was driving me behind this book. And I guess there's three answers to that question that both theoretically and that Muslims took over time. Oh, by the way, I mean I'm Muslim myself, so I really approach this from the point of view of being Muslim. So that's why if I seem like I'm talking from that perspective, that's why, for those you don't know. Okay, so the first answer would be to say, well, tough toenails. I don't know if this saying actually exists. My mom used to say it to me all the time, tough toenails. John Esposito, you ever heard the phrase tough toenails before, or is this too much of a Brown family idiolect. But anyway, Dr. Esposito can let me know what he thinks. So basically, tough luck. If it seems like a ruling from the Sharia is unjust, well, that just means that, what do you know? What is your sense of justice? What value does it have? This is the God's law, so that's it. That's the answer. The second is to say, actually, God wants justice. So if the Sharia doesn't seem to be giving you justice in this situation, and then you've misunderstood the Sharia. And actually, you should just follow what your sense of justice is. That's interesting. It does present some problems, however, which is that what do you do when you have a very clear, let's say, text in the Quran or agreed upon precedent of the Prophet Muhammad, which gives you a ruling, and then how do you misunderstand that, right? So if you say that, let's take this for example, like I mean, the best example could be, I mean, this is a really good example, right? So the Quran says that if you are going to be witnessing like a debt or a transaction or an agreement on debt, that you should bring two witnesses, either two men or one man and two women. So in case one of the women forgets, the other one can remind her. And that's a very clear ruling, right? I mean, it's very explicit. And there's a great example of this scholar, a Yemeni scholar in the early 20th century, who says, if Aisha herself, the wife of the Prophet, if she came into my court today, I would say she needs another witness with her, right? Even though Aisha actually is the source of a lot of Islamic law. So Aisha's not just her narrations of hadith from the Prophet, but also her legal opinions constitute a huge chunk of the rules of the Sharia. If she came into that scholar's court, he would say, sorry, you're basically half a witness. You're not sufficient on your own. So one answer, that's the first response I gave is his answer, which is basically, this is the law. This is what God says. You think it's unfair. This is a sir min asrar Allah. This is a divine secret that we don't have access to. Okay, so the second option of, you just sort of go with what your sense of justice is, and that's what God wants. Well, then how do you explain the fact that sometimes this really contradicts clear rulings in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet? It means you basically have to say, well, I don't care about these things. They're wrong. They're just wrong in this case. And sometimes people say that. I mean, you don't see kind of really respected Muslim scholars say that. But it's something you'll often hear from lay Muslims in times of crisis or something, or times of cultural change. I'll just say, look, well, I don't care what the Quran says on this. I know this is right. And we probably, if you're professors or community leaders, you've experienced people saying these kind of things. The third possibility is to say that that the Sharia has flexibility within it, and that it's a kind of a pluralistic tradition that doesn't usually, it very rarely has just one answer to any kind of moral or legal question. And so that actually you can take advantage of that flexibility to give a just response, or to give a just answer. So, if like, let's say, you think that it's the compensation payment for accidentally killing a non-Muslim in most schools of law is less than a Muslim. It's either like a third or something of a Muslim's compensation payment if a Muslim gets killed accidentally. You could say that doesn't seem just. So you could take the Hanafi school ruling, which says that actually the compensation payment for accidentally killing a non-Muslim, like a Christian or Jew who's under Muslim rule, is the same as a Muslim. And you could just take that, and that would seem like a just ruling, right? So you have sort of flexibility, and so you take advantage of that flexibility. Okay. And that's kind of the answer that the Madhalim court tradition gives, which is to say that if somebody comes and says comes to the Madhalim court and says they can come for a number of reasons throughout Islamic history, but one thing could be that they were wronged by a government official, like a tax collector or something. Another could be that they are unhappy with a existing legal ruling from the courts, from the normal Sharia courts, in which case they would come to the Madhalim court and say, express their discontent with the ruling. And in that case, the Madhalim court actually has much more flexibility than the normal judges' courts, which would be generally following one school of law. So the judges' court would be following, the Hanafi school or the Maliki school or whatever. In the Madhalim court, the judge can take from any school of law and maybe even go outside the existing schools of law. And so he has much more flexibility in terms of the procedure and the rulings he can draw on, so he can more easily give a just judgment. Now, one of the interesting questions that it comes up in the course of this is important to understand legal procedure in the Islamic tradition. And that's that I remember one of my students asked me this. They said, can God's law be unjust? And it's interesting because we have to distinguish between the law as a theory, both in the sense of the Sharia, like in our, prayer and ethics, how we treat our parents, how we treat our children, all these different aspects of the Sharia that are not something that's going to come into a courtroom. But also the law as a theory versus the law as applied in the court. So what's interesting is actually the answer is yes, the law can be unjust. And we know this actually comes directly from the Prophet. The law can be unjust because the judge can be unjust, because the judge is a constrained figure. This is very important. The judge in the Sharia tradition is a very constrained figure. For example, this is actually a well-known hadith of the Prophet, where two men come to the Prophet and they having a dispute, and the Prophet says, depending on the different versions of the hadith, but in some versions he says, "Innama ana basharun wa la a'lam al-ghayb." I'm just a man. I don't know the unseen. On other versions, he says, I don't know which one of you is telling the truth, and it may be that one of you is just better at presenting their argument than the other. In which case, if you win wrongly and you take your brother's property wrongly, then what you take is a share of hellfire. This is very important because what the Prophet is saying is, acting as a judge, and there's debate amongst Muslim scholars, does the Prophet actually not know? Because there's a huge debate among Muslim scholars about if the Prophet knows the ghaib or not. But forget about that, because even if he does know the unseen, he's acting like a judge to teach us how to be judges. And he's saying, the judge, don't know what's correct. So actually, I may rule wrongly. And there are restrictions on the judge that actually prevent the judge from ruling in a just way. For example, in most schools of law, the judge cannot rule by his own knowledge. So let's say I know Dr. Esposito is telling the truth. I know Dr. Esposito is lying. I saw, somebody comes and says, Dr. Esposito came over to my house. He was outside. He started throwing spaghetti against the windows of my house. He started making a huge mess, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, okay, where's your witnesses? Well, I don't have any witnesses. Oh, I'm sorry. I have to rule that he's innocent because there's not sufficient evidence. But let's say I'm the judge. I actually saw this. I was across the street and I saw Dr. Esposito doing this. I cannot rule on that basis. I can only rule on what the witnesses bring me. So there's all sorts of restrictions on the judge. There's restrictions on what the judge can do in terms of his knowledge. There's restrictions on what kind of evidence the judge can bring. And these differ especially between the schools of law. For example, in the Hanafi school of law is much more restrictive about the use of documentary evidence than the Maliki school of law, which is much more accepting of documentary evidence. So if you're a Hanafi judge, you're going to have many more rules about when you can accept documents or not. So the Madhalim court judge could, for example, take the Maliki ruling on this to make it easier to take that written evidence. So there's all sorts of evidentiary and procedural restrictions on the judge that actually prevent justice from being done. And why is that? It's there because it's trying to prevent other injustices from being done. So let's say, I'm going to offend Dr. Esposito here, but I've decided I'm going to pick on him because he decided to come to my talk. I mean, he couldn't just enjoy retirement, right? He has to come to my talk. So basically, I can say, let's say I'm a judge and someone says, Dr. Esposito came to my house and started to, throw spaghetti at the windows and things like that and make a big mess. And I say, I know Italians. We all know what they're like. Yeah, he's guilty. And by the way, we can easily imagine this happening if based on all sorts of biases against any number of different groups. So, I don't need to see the evidence. I know he's guilty. So these rules are in place to protect innocent people from being convicted without due process. Documentary evidence. Documents can be forged easily, especially before you have printers and formal letterheads and things like that. It might be a pretty, I mean, a lot of people know how to read anyway, right? So it might be easier to forge or misrepresent documentary evidence. All right. And so it's important to remember that the judge in the normal courts is very constrained, and therefore, actually, there may be lots of instances in which justice has not been done. And somebody might have a reason to say, listen, I really got a bad deal here. And that's why they go to the Madhalim court. Now, why does the Madhalim court exist? Because someone could just say, look, yeah, there's constraints on the judge. Yeah, sometimes you get bad results, but you know what? You're going to have some bad results, but you'll have mostly good results. And we trust in God's law. And so therefore, we're not going to see the need to create any other venue or forum for justice. But the ruler has a responsibility to make sure that the hukuk, the rights of God's servants, are not wasted or not lost. The judge is the job of the ruler and of the justice system and of God's law is to, as the Prophet said, to give everybody who has a haqq, a right, what their right is, to get everybody what they deserve. So this is why, and we again have instances of this in the life of the Prophet. For example, when somebody is murdered and they can't figure out who killed the person, the Prophet himself pays the compensation payment to that person's family out of basically the treasury, Beit al-Mal. So the ruler in the end is supposed to make sure that everybody gets their haqq. So the Madhalim court is established under the rubric of the ruler, not the qadis, who are theoretically separate, kind of independent from the ruler. And that will be there to make sure that people get their haqq when it's been denied by the normal court procedure. Okay. And again, this is all seen as rooted in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. All right. So that's kind of the general theme. And I should just say kind of a general outline of the book. The book is called Justice. I don't know. I didn't even know if I didn't even realize I didn't mention this. So this is all because I just finished. I am finishing writing a book on this topic. I'm just doing the introduction. Introductions are very hard. So the book is called Justice and Islamic Law, Madhalim Courts and Legal Reform. And hopefully I'll submit it finally in maybe the early spring, February or something like that, inshallah. And so the book is, okay, I'll just explain how it came about because that might be more interesting. So what happened was a couple of years ago, I was on a dissertation committee of a student who was a student at Princeton, and he was doing his PhD on legal reform and codification of law in the late Ottoman Empire. And he was talking about how the Ottomans had basically created courts where Christians and Jews and Muslims would all be equal before the law in terms of witnessing and things like that. And I said, well, how do you justify this? Because, the general rule in Islamic law is that you can't have a non-Muslim serving as a kind of a definitive witness against a Muslim. And this is, very, very widely held ruling. And if there's exceptions to it, they're very limited. And he said, well, actually, so the people who are advocating for these and kind of articulating and organizing these courts, these Nizamiya courts, they're called in the late Ottoman period. They pointed to a treatise written by a scholar named Jalaluddin Davani on Madhalim courts. Hang on, I have to turn my computer to focus mode because my kids are sending me a bunch of messages. Okay. That's really interesting. And I was like, I wonder if I could find this. And I happened to be talking to some of my students who are from Istanbul, and they said, "Oh yeah, we'll get you this, no problem. It's a manuscript. We can get the PDF for you." So they got PDF of the manuscript of the unpublished manuscript of this text by the scholar Jalaluddin Davani, and I started to read it, and it's just a text about Madhalim courts. And so I got really interested in this topic, and then kind of more broadly got interested in these questions of kind of justice and Islamic law. All right. So then I happened to be, I think, the semester after that, I had sabbatical after, what did I have sabbatical for? Maybe it was, could it have been when I got tenure? I think maybe I got tenure and I had a semester off. And so I did, that year I did law school at Georgetown Law School. So professors were very nice and they let me sit in on all the classes. And so I took basically most of the first year law school classes and then a couple of extra ones on property law and things like that and Roman law. And so we started to get interested in kind of some of the theoretical questions behind this topic of justice and law, because in the common law tradition, you have what's called the equity courts or courts of equity. And these were kind of emerged in the medieval period because there were certain rules of English common law which really kind of were really yielding unfair results, especially on things like estates and inheritance. And so what would happen is people started to go to the chancellor, usually who was a member of the Church of England, and they were using kind of Roman law principles to solve some of these cases. And so you created this other venue for dealing with legal issues where people felt like they had been wronged in the normal courts. So I was thinking that really made me think more comparatively about this question. All right. So then what I ended up doing for the book is to write the first chapter, which is basically a history of Madhalim courts in Islamic civilization, going all the way from the beginning when they emerge in the kind of early Abbasid period, to the late Ottoman Empire. And even into this day in Saudi Arabia, you have a Divan al-Madhalim in Saudi Arabia. And part of one of the things I look at is kind of how these functions change over time. At various points in time in Islamic history, Madhalim courts function as kind of catch-alls for all sorts of things that don't really function well in the normal courts. A lot of times they function as criminal law courts. So things like murder or someone getting mugged, where there's no witnesses. Someone gets murdered on a highway. There's some kind of scheme to murder somebody and it's covered up and no one knows who did it. These kind of situations would often end up at various points in times in Islamic history in the Madhalim court, right? So I kind of go through Islamic civilization by different regions and different times. And there's a lot of secondary source scholarship already on this. So I was amalgamating material, doing my own research in places where I thought there wasn't enough material and trying to come up with a comprehensive history. Then what I did is I got very interested in its three personalities and three different times, and I'll explain why. So it all started with this student who I mentioned, who told me that this Ottoman, one of basically the main architect of the Nizamiya courts in the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century, was a scholar slash administrator named Ahmed Cevdet Pasha, who died in 1895. So Cevdet Pasha is actually asked this question: how are you going to deal with Muslims and non-Muslims being on equal footing as witnesses in these Nizamiya courts? And he says, well, according to Jalaluddin Davani in his treatise on Madhalim, this is not a problem. They can be equal. Of course, Davani actually does not say that explicitly in the treatise, but you could argue it from what he says. Then Cevdet Pasha actually gives a translation, a summary and a translation of important parts of Davani's treatise as part of his argument for the Islamic legitimacy of the Nizamiya court system. So I had one instance of this late 19th century context of Ottoman reform in which Cevdet Pasha is using his own version, his own kind of redaction and translation and interpretation of Davani's text as his justification for the Nizamiya court system. Jalaluddin Davani, he died in 1502, was really the last great Sunni scholar of Iran. The last great Sunni scholar of Iran. He's from near Shiraz, and he lives there most of his life, although he travels around. And he was especially his theological and his philosophical and his ethical writings were extremely important in the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal kind of Persianate curricula. Especially his ethical text, his philosophical texts were very, very important. Not so much his legal writing. So what Cevdet Pasha says is, here's what Jalaluddin Davani says about Madhalim courts, and his opponents say, well, if Davani thinks that, then we can't argue. So he basically brings this huge name to justify his reforms, and then that is something that his opponents kind of just cede to. Okay, so then you go back to Davani's text, which is originally in Persian, and what he did is he actually built it on Mawardi, Abul Hasan Mawardi. We all know him, the famous Shafi jurist from Basra who lived in Baghdad, who died in 1058 of the Common Era, Shafi jurist. Davani, by the way, is also Shafi. So what Mawardi had written this as a chapter in his Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, his famous ordinances of governance, which is basically his book is adding on to another book on the same topic and with the same title by the senior Hanbali judge of Baghdad, Qadi Abu Ya'la ibn al-Farra, who died in 1066 of the Common Era. So Qadi Abu Ya'la writes a book on ordinance of government. Mawardi takes that book and stuffs a bunch of other material, and especially lots of poetry and stories and things like that. And it sometimes gives extra legal discussions. And one chapter of that book is on Madhalim courts. So this is really the first and most extensive discussion of Madhalim courts in Islamic history, is by Mawardi. In his context of kind of late Buyid Iraq, late Buyid Abbasid Iraq and Baghdad. So Davani takes this, summarizes parts of it, translates directly other parts of it, and then adds a whole bunch of his own material from his experience as a judge and a scholar in southern Iran in the late 1400s. So in this book, I look through kind of the history of this text as it moves through these three contexts: late Buyid Abbasid Baghdad in the writing of Mawardi, Ak-Kayunlu, and then kind of lawless, crisis-filled southern Iran in the late 1400s in the context of Jalaluddin Davani, and then late 19th century reform-oriented Istanbul in the writings of Cevdet Pasha. All right. So then I kind of look at these three contexts and trace the text as it journeys and grows and shrinks and is changed in this process. And then the last two chapters of the book look at the actual legal issues raised in by the topic of Madhalim courts. And I look at things like really issues of procedure, legal procedure and substance. For example, what about using documentary evidence? Another question that's kind of not so appealing to people, but is a big deal, is whether or not you can use what's called judicial torture. So can you inflict pain on somebody who's a suspect in order to get them to confess or to give you information? And Muslim scholars fall into different positions on this. A lot of them say absolutely not. This person's innocent. Some of them say yes, you can. They have their justifications, which we won't get into right now. But one of the things that the Madhalim court judge can do is actually use things like judicial torture to get results where the normal judge would not be allowed to do this in some schools of law. Then I also look at the ability of the judge to switch between madhabs and different schools of law. How is that, can the Madhalim judge go like outside all of the four madhabs? Can he go into even earlier pre-madhab Islamic law to draw on legal rulings? And then the last chapter is kind of looking almost at what we might consider kind of theological and constitutional issues. How do we think about this idea of justice and God's justice versus the fiqh, the kind of actual substance of Islamic law? And how do we explain how did Muslim scholars historically deal with instances of discord between theories of justice and the actual details of the law? All right. So that's the kind of outline of the book. I'm happy to answer questions or whatever about that when we get to that point. Okay, so then it was an interesting experience for me to write this book because I actually wrote 90% of this book years ago. It would probably be 2014 to 2016. I was writing this. I was obsessed with it. I wrote 90% of this book. I got the different I think there's 4 different manuscripts of Davani's text. I did a critical edition of the Persian text. I translated that, annotated a translation of that text. I compared it to the Mawardi's original text. I got Jevdet Pasha's text of it. I translated that. I looked at the difference between that and Davani's text. I did all the research. I did all the writing, the history of Madhalim courts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I went and I was going to finish it. And then I got kind of sidetracked on writing about and researching about issues of slavery in Islam. So I wrote a book on slavery in Islamic law or slavery in Islamic civilization. Then there were leftover questions from that on issues of race. And so I wrote a book on Islam and Blackness. And that book came out. And I had all this, I just kind of gave up on this. I said, you know what? It's a pity. I just don't know. I couldn't get back to it. I couldn't figure out how to organize the book in a way that made sense to me. And I just sort of despaired. And then this summer, I was in Malaysia at a conference with some of my friends. I don't know if any of them are on here, or if my friends are not sufficiently good friends of mine to actually attend my talks. Apparently they're not. So one of my friends, whose name is, I'll tell you, his name is Osama Azami. Some of you may know him. So Osama Azami said, can you send me the chapters of your book on
Sorry,
Madhalim court? It sounds
sorry,
really
Jonathan. Osama was actually one of our guests in a Majlis.
Yeah,
So
so he
yeah,
obviously knows about them, arguably has this time free in his schedule, depending on when. But I guess this week he had something more important to do. So that's fine. So anyway, Osama said, can you send me the chapters? And I was like, yeah, I can get depressed, but okay, I'll send them to you. So then I just went back and I remember where was I? I guess I would be in the hotel room in Malaysia. And I was like, starting to read. I can't just send these to Osama like this. I got to go through and make sure they make sense. Started to read through it. And I was like, suddenly realized how I could organize the book. And then I started to be obsessed with this topic once again. And I got home and it was August, and I just spent all of August. Classes hadn't started yet. So I just got all my time trying to fill in the different cracks and look up the research that had come out on Madhalim courts since I had written it and things like that. And since then, I've been kind of trying to finish up the book. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that sometimes you start projects and something comes up, or you oh, I forgot another thing. And I don't know if this is too inside baseball, but I'm not going to name any names, so it should be fine. So actually, I submitted this book proposal to a certain press, which will not be named. And actually, not only did I submit the book proposal, I submitted, I had 5 or, whatever, 4 complete chapters done. And they sent this to 3 readers, and 2 of the readers said, this is terrific. And, maybe do this, change that, but this is really good. The third response was, I've never seen anything. I had never seen anything, nor have I seen anything since like this. It was a page, I think it was like 1 solid page of text, just saying this was the worst thing the person had ever seen, and that the book failed in every regard to deal with in everything that the book tried to do, it failed in every way. I mean, it was such a comprehensive rejection that it sort of undermined itself, because it would say things like, this book doesn't even define Madhalim courts. But I mean, you might not like my definition, but it definitely defines them. I mean, this person, I don't know if they didn't read the book, but clearly somebody had some beef with me or something. And then it turned out, actually, the editor said, actually, this was a member of our editorial board who actually asked to write this. So apparently somebody had beef, but it was really defeat. I remember it. It was February of 2017. So Trump had just been inaugurated the first time. And, people were all stressed out, and the Muslim ban and all this stuff. And it was really maybe one of the most professionally defeating experiences I had, really, to like someone just totally, and I actually wrote to the editor and I said, this seems a little bit extreme. And the editor said, yeah. Just when you're done with the book, send it to us again, and we'll send it to the first 2 readers, not the third person. I was like, okay, that's fine. But anyway, I guess my moral would be to you, although some of you are not really young and senior to me, but for those of you who are junior or curious about this, would be to, 1, sometimes you get sidetracked, but it doesn't mean that you won't get back to a project in the end. Don't give up hope on a project. And 2, sometimes you get bad reviews, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the objections are valid. And you have to accept that sometimes people can be a little bit nasty, but you should take, the good and leave the bad when you get reviews. And it's been a long time since I've written articles, but I remember this, when you'd write an article, especially like for Islamic law and society, and you get these sometimes like pretty strong criticisms for your submission. And I always used to get so upset. I would be like screaming and yelling and throwing stuff and flipping out and so outraged. And then, I realized, okay, give it a few days, calm down. Then you realize, actually, no, this person's making a good point. And, in the end, these are actually sources for ways to make your argument better. So, first you have an emotional reaction. It's all right. Don't do it in public. Don't write anything on social media. Have your meltdown, yell at call your friend on the phone or your spouse or your dog or whatever. And then after a few days, start to think more like, yeah, actually, this is actually, some good advice here. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. All right. Let's see here. All right. Some other things that I learned in this process, which I think are useful, which is when you're doing, anytime you read anything, take good notes. Anytime something interests you, for me, I don't have any with me here, but I have these like kind of marble, those like kind of marble colored, they're called marble notebooks. They have kind of different color on the cover, and it's sort of like a soft cover notebook, like the kind of thing you use in grade school. So I have those, and I'll just, everything I read or come across, or even if I see it's something on TV, it's interesting, or something on the internet, or even I walk down the street, I see like a street sign, there's something interesting about a street sign, I'll write down that in the notebook. And um, always make sure to note like where you saw something, where you read something, page numbers, etc., all the bibliographical information you need. And then when I start to get interested in a project or an idea, I'll go back through all the notebooks I've filled up, which I think now I have like 22 or 23 of these notebooks, and I'll review them and I'll say, oh, okay, here's something that might be interesting for this project, let's say on Madhalim courts. So for that, I had I called it DAV, like for Davani. So I would write DAV in a circle, and I put that next to that note in the book. And so then when you're ready to kind of start going from research to writing, or outlining and then writing a project, I go back to all my notebooks and I see, I just look for that symbol for that project, and I take that information, which already has all the citation information. I put it in my, like a big Word document, which just has all this information. And then once I have all this material, this evidence, basically this data in this Word doc, I'll go through and start to organize the book, like how, what are the different sections, what fits where, what is evidence for what, and then basically I'll develop the outline, and then I'll just write the book or the article or whatever, the chapter, into the outline. It already has all the uh, bibliographical information and footnotes done. So that's, I think, a very useful thing is to keep good notes, because you might say to yourself, oh, I know what I meant when I wrote this note, or I know where I got this source, or I know which book this is. Guess what? In a year's time or 2 years' time or whenever, you're not going to have any idea what you're talking about. So always take good notes and make sure you, especially bibliographical information. And I mean, especially nowadays, like, you'll be like on social media or like on the internet, and there's like some tweet, and you're like, oh, wow, this is really good evidence for this topic. Screenshot it. You learn how to cite online sources, so get the information you need for an online source, and then put that, and then I'll also have like for example, for, let's say, the Islam Blackness book. There's all these debates online about Islam is anti-black, Arab slave trade, Arabs are anti-black, things like that. Tons and tons of people talking about this online. I would always screenshot this, save the link, get the citation information, right? And then I would create a folder on my computer, because this obviously I can't put in books, and then have put in notebooks, and then have a folder with all the different screenshots that I would use for that project as well. So as new technologies come along, maybe there'll be like TikTok evidence in books. I'm sure we'll be citing TikTok at some point. Figure out how to do that. Okay. Yeah, that's everything I had to, I think. Oh, sorry, one more thing. This is very, very important. And I've learned this over many books, and it is so important, which is for me, the best source are my colleagues and my friends and my students. There is no amount of, I mean, I guess there is infinite amount of reading, but there is no substitute for having friends, scholars, colleagues, scholarly colleagues, teachers, students who are experts in all sorts of things, whom you can turn to ask questions. So a lot of things that I've written about in my life, I was not really an expert in at all. And either to get specific information or to learn how to start learning about something, I had turned to other people who were my seniors, my peers, or my juniors. And this is the most amazing resource. And, I talked about feeling kind of moments of scholarly defeat where you get a bad review or you get something rejected and you feel awful. And, or someone comes and says, I read this book and this guy is not even a scholar. He's an embarrassment or whatever. This person's a joke. People can say these kind of things and you feel bad about yourself because it hurts. Like one of my friends, Andrew March, said this, that academics, it's so painful when our work gets criticized because there's no alienation between us and the work. Like it's direct outcome of our minds, of who we of our beings almost. Like there's no way, there's no other, it's not like I worked on a project and I've been working, at Ford Motor Company or something, and I'm working on a car and someone else is working on the same car and someone criticizes the car in the end. Like, there's a lot of other people who are involved in a lot of steps and a lot of feedback and things like that. No, this is something that comes directly out of your brain. And it's very painful when someone doesn't like it. But I came to realize that for me, the biggest, uh, let's say, like evidence for my value as a scholar was that there were people who I respected who wanted to help me and who were always eager to help me in projects. So that's very important. And to really like cultivate friends, whether your teachers or your students or your peers who you learn from and who are there to help you when you need help. And then, of course, to be helpful to them in turn. All right. That's all I have to say.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. You turned upside down the structure, but it worked very well. So actually, you turned it back to its natural format, because normally that's what we do. We give a scholarly talk, and then we have a discussion at dinner. I I I asked our guest to do the opposite way, but yeah, you returned it, and it's great, and I'm very grateful. You gave us a lot about the topic and your openness. Yeah, thank you for it. I just wanted to ask you about this devastating evil review. Was there anything useful in it? Did you find it useful in any way? And it's this very night I realized something which probably is obvious for most of you. Then you mentioned our colleagues, friends, and their input, and I just realized that actually people whom we dislike can be also useful in that they can say things what are very useful, and they can be even right. We doesn't need to like a person to learn from them. So how was with that review? Was there anything useful in it other than testing you to the limit and feeling the humiliation that other people can?
I mean,
uh,
what I would say about that specific review is what made it unique was that it didn't have any like real criticism. It was almost, um, it was so divorced from reality that it was not useful. But that was what made it, I felt like some personal issue because somebody can have all sorts of very serious, painful criticisms that are true. I mean, I remember one time I wrote this chapter and one of the reviewers says, this reads like an incomplete piece, and it may be because it is incomplete. And I was like, ouch. But then I was like, that the reason why it hurts is because it's true. Like, I remember one time when I was, when I was teaching at University of Washington in Seattle, the normal professor was on leave and I taught third year Arabic. And this was probably like 2008 or something. And one of the student reviews said, I've never had a teacher who cared less about a class. And it hurt so much. But then I was like, you know what? They were right. They called me out. I didn't care and I didn't try, and they were right in their assessment. So sometimes stuff is painful, but it's true. As Alec Guinness says in Lawrence of Arabia, you tread harshly, but you speak the truth, right? You can have instances where people tread harshly, but they speak the truth.
yeah, I fully agree. It really hurts when it is true. Then because if it's just animosity, then yeah, well, you know that. But Yeah. Jonathan, would you still talk to us some minutes about how did you get to this whole research, uh, the whole field in general of your own personal
My
and
actual like
intellectual history? Yeah, yeah, yeah,
my
yeah.
intellectual history.
And
Well,
well, it doesn't need to be just
yeah, I mean
intellectual. It can be social, whatever, from your
yeah,
birth
I
or
mean,
from your distant ancestors. You can go as
yeah.
deep as you want to.
So I mean, I guess I was, uh, I was in college at Georgetown as an undergraduate, and the best thing happened to me, which is I didn't take class with John Esposito, and therefore my brain was preserved. It was not just, I'm just joking. I actually never took class with Dr. Esposito because he only taught these SF School of Foreign Service classes, and I was in the College of Arts and Sciences, so I never got a chance to take class with him. But when I became, I randomly, Georgetown has a theology requirement. You have to take two theology requirements, two theology classes. And the second class, I randomly just decided to take on Islamic thought and practice. I was a freshman. And after that class, long story short, I became Muslim in that summer. And so then I was just so, I wanted to learn everything I could about Islam and anything to do with Islam. Arabic, Middle East history, Islam and French literature and culture. I took a class on Islam and French literature and culture. And so I just took, and Georgetown had, alhamdulillah, had a lot of great offerings on this topic. So I took lots of classes with John Vole, with Gabor Augustin, who's still my colleague, with Patrick Lode, who's still my colleague. And I just got so interested. And then one of my professors told me, if you really want to keep doing this, you need to go learn Arabic really well. So I applied for the Center for Arabic Study Abroad CASA program in Egypt, and I graduated in 2000. Um, and then I applied, and that was before 9/11. So I actually got into CASA. After 9/11, there was so much demand, I never would have gotten into CASA. I only had, not even 2 years of Arabic when I applied. And I went, and I lived in Cairo from 2000 to 2001, and I studied Arabic. And I also started to attend the lessons of the person who would become later the Mufti of Egypt, Ali Juma. And so I started to kind of learn about living Islamic scholarship, actual Muslim scholars who are working today, and it wasn't just something you read about in books. And then I really just wanted to keep learning. I mean, I didn't even think about what I was doing. I just wanted to keep doing what I was doing. And so I applied for graduate school, and I ended up going to University of Chicago. And my advisor was Wadad Al-Qadi. And I went there. I remember I drove to Chicago 5 days after 9/11 and started my PhD. And um, I was actually supposed to study Islamic. Is this boring? I don't want to talk about it. Is this like the kind of stuff you want to hear about? Okay. So then I wanted to, I was actually supposed to study Islamic philosophy. And I don't know why they let me in because there was no one studying Islamic philosophy there. But there was a couple of students who were studying Hadith with Professor Qadi. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. I didn't know you could actually study this. And there's, oh yeah, of course. So I started to I got really interested because when I learned about Islam in college, I'd really learned about it through like kind of Islamic modernist perspective, people like Fazlur Rahman, Muhammad Asad, and they were not really big into Hadith. And so I had you'd see or you'd hear at like Muslim Student Association barbecue or something, you'd hear someone talk about Bukhari and Muslim, Bukhari and Muslim, Bukhari and Muslim. I was like, who's these Bukhari and Muslim guys? Everyone's always talking about. And when I was in my first year of graduate school, I went back to Cairo to visit my friends, and I found this like book on this, in the bookstore. It's like a little one of these really cheap printings of a book, and it was a book on Hadith terminology, and it was actually edited by this famous Saudi scholar Muhammad Salih ibn Uthaymeen, who died in 2001, and he kept mentioning in the footnotes that this guy Dara Qutni had criticized Bukhari and Muslim's books. And I was like, I didn't know you could do that. I thought you can't criticize Bukhari and Muslim's books. So then I was really interested in this scholar, Dara Qutni, who died in 995 of the Common Era from Baghdad, a huge Sunni Hadith scholar. So I started to read his books, and I did my master's thesis, what then called a second year paper, now it's called a master's thesis, on his criticism of Bukhari and Muslim. So then I was like, oh, this is really interesting. Like, I wonder how this fits into the canonization of Bukhari and Muslim. And I was like, somebody must have written a book about this, but no one had. So then I did my dissertation on that topic. And then I was fortunate. I graduated at a time they were handing out jobs at the door, people. They were handing out jobs at the door. 2006. No, wait, it was 2005. So I applied for 10 jobs, and I stopped at 10 just because I was like, that's enough. There were I mean, there must have been like maybe 20 jobs that year in Islamic studies of different kind of religious studies, Near Eastern studies, et cetera, et cetera. I was fortunate enough to get a job at Georgetown, no, at University of Washington in Seattle. And I went and I taught there for 4 years. Oh, and then I forgot to say that during my time at University of Chicago, lo and behold, who comes to town to give a speech at University of Chicago but John Esposito, right? And so, he's not going to accept just any taxi taking him to the airport or something. He wants to be chauffeured to the airport. So he says, I know you. Weren't you at Georgetown? And he told me, and of course, he was being very kind and mentoring me and everything. So he took me, I drove him to the airport. Of course, was very intimidated. But then he started to, every time I would go back, because my family lived in Washington, D.C., I'd go back to Georgetown and see my old friends and visit my old professors. So I got to know Professor Esposito, even though he'd never been my actual professor. So then in 2009, a job opened up at Georgetown, and I applied for it, and I was very fortunate to get that job, and then I came here. That's interesting, I guess.
It is very interesting. I'm hesitant to ask you to go even deeper, because you summarized in one sentence. I just became Muslim, and I would be very curious. It doesn't just happen this way. And also I well, we haven't met before, and I can honestly say I admire your courage, because you are breaking through lots of limits and I mean borders, and yeah, which I mentioned, going out of academia and engaging with the public. That's one thing, but also to do this as a Muslim while being a Western scholar as well. Well, of course, there are many Muslims doing that, but you also come from an original non-Muslim background, so all these must be considerable challenges. And yeah, it's how, if you do you want to talk about this? How
Yeah,
do you,
I mean, I'm fine talking about this. So, I mean, when I was in, so I grew up like my family was Episcopalian Christian, which is like American version of Anglican Church. And but my family was not very, they were not religious. We had to go to church every Sunday, but that was like all I remember is they had really good donuts, and uh I loved communion wine. I was definitely going to be an alcoholic. I really liked communion wine. And I was actually an acolyte up until all the way up until the senior level. So I actually helped prepare the communion. Um, but for me, that was just a way to get access to the communion wine earlier than other people in the service. But it was weird because my family was not religious at all. But it was like some tradition. You had to go to church on Sunday, but there was no religion played no role in anyone's life in my family. So but I think I had a lot of maybe existential anxiety, which I think is pretty normal for teenagers or people in general. But I really had, I guess, like a longing for truth. And when I learned about Islam, I think it just for me, I said this is what I was looking for, and this is what the answer I was looking for. So I decided to become Muslim. And I was, at an age, I think I was like 18 or 19 maybe. And, you know, it was very ideal choice. Like I didn't think about any consequences. I was unattached. I mean, I was sort of away from my family. I wasn't married. I didn't have any, so you're sort of like this. It was a very intellectual, the decision of a person who's just this sort of mind that's floating free in the universe. And so I think maybe I found there were consequences later on that I hadn't considered, but I never regretted that choice. I've never regretted it. And then I guess, my whole life since then, and as an academic has been, so I never intended to become a professor. I always, even when I was in my PhD program, I thought I was going to be like some kind of analyst, or I don't know what I was thinking, but I never thought I was going to be a professor. And it wasn't until very late, maybe just when I was applying for jobs, I realized, look, you got to be a professor. That's what you have to do. Which of course was obvious. Like my mom was an academic, my grandparents were professors, so it was probably pretty obvious to anybody who saw me that I was going to be a professor or that I should be in academia. But and by the way, I couldn't do anything else. Like I would be totally screwed if I didn't have a job as a professor. I mean, I'm useless. I mean, there's one thing I can do well. I can clean bathrooms very well. And I actually don't mind doing that either. I could really be like, maybe clean rich people's bathrooms really well and they'd pay me decently. I could think maybe that'd be a good job. But I wouldn't have any other, there's nothing else I could have done. I don't think. And so my whole life since I became Muslim was really, I just want to know answers to questions. I want to know how to understand my religion. I want to know where are the boundaries between religion and culture? What is it? When is it okay as a Muslim when does Islam change? And when is that acceptable? And in what ways does it have to stay the same? How does changes in culture and circumstance justify changing your beliefs or your ethics? So, I mean, everything I've written, or every book I've written, every article I've written, is always trying to answer my own questions as a Muslim. And so I've learned that when I have questions, usually other people have the same questions, at least some people. And so my efforts can help them as well. So, and earlier on in my career, I was much more kind of scholarly in the things I wrote about. And then as I got older, I wanted to kind of try and take on more general topics and also write maybe for a more general audience. I would claim, or I believe, that my work, even the most general work, is of a very high academic quality. I would invite any challenge to that. But I definitely stopped, tried to write for an audience that was, maybe educated New York Times reader or something, or someone who's interested in these questions. But I never assume that the reader has any background when I write books now.
Can I make a comment? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I just thought I'd point out that there is a link between Jack and myself, and that is that the niece of Ismail al-Faruqi, my mentor, I believe, taught Jack in
Yeah,
his.
exactly. She was Maysam al-Faruqi. By the way, if anyone knows where Maysam al-Faruqi is, I've been trying to get in touch with her for years. I think she lives in Lebanon, but I have no idea. If anyone has any contact with her, I would love to have her contact info.
Jack is brilliant, and really he's one of the great hires that I. Not the best because he never cleaned my bathroom, but. But when Jack did his presentation, what struck me was you had this long presentation talking about prominent figures in Islamic history, and he'd always know the year that they died. I mean, he'd always say, I've never heard anybody do that. And I just thought at a certain point he'd refer to me and tell me when I was going to die, and he didn't do that. So I've always held that against him. But
we only past events. So but I'd say this, and this is maybe like advice. So I don't know if I ever told you this, but when I did that job talk, I memorized the whole job talk. I'm not trying to say like I'm such a genius, I memorized it. No, I worked so hard on that job talk that I essentially memorized it word for word. And because I was so nervous. I wanted that job so badly that I remember flying in the airplane, I think I was flying international from Seattle on Alaska Air. And so you would like I remember sort of that when you turn in and the airline's like flying along the Potomac River, twisting and turning. I remember like just reciting the job talk in my head over and over again. Because the reason I bring this up is if you really want to do a good job in a presentation, you can always just memorize the entire presentation. There's no limit to the amount of preparation you can do. You can decide at a certain point it's not worth it, but you can really, really prepare very well for a presentation.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. I also consider often cleaning as a viable option, but I don't know whether we would earn enough to maintain our families. It's a rewarding job because, well, something was dirty and then it is clean. It's clearly something good. I'm truly very grateful for everything what you said and for your openness. I'm actually really impressed by it, though it's not unusual in a Majlis. So we will conclude the recording and we will start the discussion. But before we do that, I just want to advertise our next week Majlis, which will be by Jan-Peter Hartung, approaching Taliban ideology through layers of time, and it will be also, well, discussing his Peter's book, The Pashtun Borderland. I don't know, Peter, do you want to say something about it now? We didn't discuss it, but as you are here.
No, actually.
Okay. Then
I'm still in the process of memorizing my presentation.
Well done. Yes. Okay. So please come next week as well. And then I close the recording and then we start the discussion. Yes.
Okay.